All right, good morning, everyone. We'll start in just a few seconds now. Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the IXIASOFT webinar, a periodical series where we invite experts to discuss hot topics in the telecom industry. I'm your host, Amandine Mondelis, Marketing Coordinator at IXIASOFT. In today's episode, Amber Swope, Information Architect at DITA Strategies, and Rob Kimm, Data Specialist at IXIASOFT, will discuss content governance, how it can help your organization's content operations, and how to achieve efficient and long-lasting governance. Before we dive in, here are a few housekeeping details to keep in mind. So first, as audience members, you are muted. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a questions and answers sessions with our speakers. Please feel free to submit your questions using your Q&A panel of the webinar platform. You can do it at any point during the presentation, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. After today's webinar, you will receive a link to its recording. You can then share it with your peers or watch it again. All right, so now it's time to kick off today's episode. Amber, Rob, welcome to IXIASOFT. And now before we get in, hi Rob, hi Amber. So before we get into today's topic, I'll let you guys introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi, my name is Amber Swope. I am an information architect and I have a consulting company called DITA Strategies. We help folks implement DITA and we focus on helping people develop their management information architecture. And you can go check out our website to learn all about DITA information architecture.
Hi, I'm Rob Kimm. I'm a DITA specialist at IXIASOFT, and I've been a DITA architect and user and DITA evangelist since 2006. I've been with IXIASOFT for the last 6 years. I was a former IXIASOFT customer, so went through an implementation of the IXIASOFT CCMS. And during that project, happened to work with a certain information architect who you may have just met. And I occasionally speak at conferences, TechCon conferences, DITA conferences, and things like that.
Well, and this is what we're going to talk to you about. So I just set your expectations appropriately. So let's move here. So we're going to talk about governance, and we've realized that the first thing that we needed to do is explain what governance means to us. And we felt that this was the best definition of governance because it's a guide for activities. It's not restrictions. And you know, the other thing that I would add to this is that it would be beneficial to the stakeholders who actually use it. But we will go through that as we talk about the different aspects of governance. And we're going to talk about aspects of governance in these 4 quadrants. We're going to talk about the business, information architecture, technology, and process. These are 4 very different but interactive aspects of any DITA implementation.
So we'll first, the first quadrant we're going to talk about is the business aspect of it. From a governance standpoint, for a business objectives, it has to start with clear, actionable requirements and clear, measurable goals. If you don't have those 2 things, it's hard to have an idea of what your objectives are, what your purpose is in trying to build a governance model. But that also has to be balanced with realistic scope of objectives and realistic assignment of responsibilities. The overly broad committee to save the world approach rarely works. as you start to build that governance model and define, both the requirements and the roles and responsibilities, it pays to pay particular attention to the integration points between things, whether that's between systems, between teams, between functional groups within your organization, because often individual groups may have processes that work well and requirements that they understand, but when they have to integrate with other parts of the organization, sometimes that's where things fall apart on you. So it takes some political will. It takes some management support, and it also takes ground level buy-in on behalf of the people who are going to have to execute their business tasks under that kind of governance model. And most of all, perhaps it takes committed resources in terms of people, in terms of time, and in terms of budget. Governance isn't something that just happens organically. It has to be deliberate, and it has to be planned, and it has to be resourced.
And it has to have continuous. This isn't a one-time deal. This is you put it in place and you have to tend it. It doesn't just is not a one and done.
No, it's not an event. Absolutely. Right. Go to the next slide. So an example of a successful case where a governance model and successful governance helped an organization to achieve some pretty interesting, pretty challenging objectives was a company that used an external system as a source for very specific and very, very critical product data. They had integrated that data into their documentation because it was a very important part of their documentation delivery. But their content reuse and accessing that external data required manual transcription. It was basically hand copying, cutting and pasting this data from one system to another. So not only was there a lot of manual effort, but in terms of governance, the organization had no real validation process or method for tracking changes in source data and making sure that those changes were reflected in their tech content. So as the organization was analyzing its processes and analyzing its requirements, they flagged this open loop process as a place where there was a risk in their process because of a lack of governance. So the team that they recognized that data leveraged from this external system counted as an authoring source in their tech pubs content, but they didn't have a clearly defined roles and responsibilities for the validation process. So they decided that since this was a largely manual process when they started this effort, they decided to automate the process because it didn't really require manual intervention. It was really low value add for high effort cut and paste in terms of resource commitment. And they realized they could automate it and kind of solve two problems with one thing. One was to use triggers to automate updates, and two, to take the manual intervention out of the process, which prevented human errors. So they had clear requirements, recognized risk, invested in mitigating or eliminating that risk, and we were able to not only have a governable, validatable process and validatable data, they also freed up resources on the authoring side as well.
I think the most important part here is that it tracks directly to a business need. It was something that management could get behind.
And it was easy for that organization to commit to that effort because it was, they were able to put their rigor where their risk was. All right, next slide. On the other hand, a different organization that kind of had similar needs in terms of governance, but didn't commit to it because there were business culture barriers that prevented them from doing so. So this is a very large organization that was a manufacturer that had kind of as a longstanding corporate culture, the idea that different facilities and different parts of the manufacturing process, which happened at different locations from raw materials to finished goods to packaged consumer products, their corporate culture was that they could manage their business best because they knew their business best. That worked fine until they tried to get all of their businesses onto a global system that was supposed to manage their supply chain or help them manage their supply chain. And system adoption was mandated, and therefore system adoption was universal. But what they didn't have was global alignment on how different parts of the system were supposed to work and what different points of data in the system meant. So when they tried to integrate these systems, each user of the system was making their own rules and making their own decisions about what data meant and how different systems were used, how different fields were used. And so the data integration, when they tried to roll it up to get this global picture of their supply chain, was absolute chaos. And it took them years to go back to square one and untangle the whole puzzle and get everybody aligned on the same page. And this is something that could have been prevented by recognizing the importance of the integration points up front. So next slide. So from a business standpoint, here are some of the opportunities for you to think about as you think about building a governance model and using a governance model, developing a governance model to manage some of the business challenges, some of the business objectives that you have. One of the first and one of the simplest is to recognize process risk. Where in your process do you have vulnerabilities in terms of efficiency, in terms of validation, in terms of automation or manual effort, the introduction of human error, those things? Where's your risk? And then build process rigor and governance to mitigate that risk. Part of doing that is having a really, a clear and honest understanding of what your risk tolerance is. How much are you able to accept as risk in to get gains in other areas?
And that's something that really can very much differ by industry.
Right, absolutely. When your burden is high because you're in a highly regulated industry, you have safety considerations or approvals from regulatory agencies, things like that, then that burden becomes much, much higher, and you have to govern those processes and that content much more carefully. As I mentioned already, when you are looking at processes or policies that are at points of intersect between teams and systems, design those points of intersect carefully and be very, very clear about roles and responsibilities and ownership. And in the example of something that didn't go very well, they had all the technical ability in the world to achieve their objectives, but they didn't recognize that there are cultural barriers. Sometimes, corporate culture or different organizations with different attitudes that can be as challenging to overcome as technical ones. Sometimes they're more challenging because all it takes is someone to just say, no, we're not going to play. And your task of governance becomes much more difficult. And ultimately, it's recognizing that implementing a common tool isn't enough. And that tool can be an actual technical tool. A tool can be the process. It's not enough to just implement the tool and say, here it is. You have to create a common understanding about what that tool or process means in terms of roles, responsibilities, ownerships, and priorities.
Okay. So the next quadrant we'll talk about is information architecture. And my overview starts off with, these are things that you really need to think about. You can't design a solid IA if you don't know what the definition of success is. This means that you have to know who your stakeholders are. You have to have a way for getting their requirements. And you have to have a way to document those requirements and review them with other stakeholders so that you get alignment. Effective in this second bullet refers to the consistent and thorough and iterative process. You don't do this once and you're done. You go through this process of IA analysis and design. You go through, you look at a set of content. As the business needs change, or you bring more groups in, you go through this again and again. And every time you learn more about the content, you learn more about the structure, you learn how metadata might power things. And it's an evolution and basically a living organism. It's not enough to document things. You have to do it consistently so that when people need to see the latest thing, they know what to expect. And just because you wrote it down doesn't mean that all your stakeholders understand or agree or will comply. The management IA is the content source in the CMS. Many organizations have multiple information architectures. They have the management IA for their central repository, and then they have delivery IA for each of the different delivery platforms where users access the content. When you're doing reuse, controlled reuse is the key, because if you let people do whatever they want, surprise, they will. And enforce consistent element usage. This means going beyond guidance. It's not enough to explain to people why they should use which elements, because with particularly XML, the transforms are dependent upon specific elements being in specific places. You will get surprises in your output if you do not enforce this, and highly encourage folks to go that extra step and provide some conformance validation in addition to just the DTD validation. Next slide. So our success story is a team that did so many things right. They established that clear definition of success for every iteration. And each of these iterations was bound to specific business needs. They set the expectation from the business with all stakeholders that we're going to make a change. This change starts from the business quadrant, goes through the IA, then into technology and into process. And therefore, it was nicely scoped. Everyone was on board, and they were able to measure the success when it was done. That is huge. They established this communication throughout the entire business, because, and they started off with basically a summit. They brought everybody who needed to be involved into the room, starting with the business all the way through delivery and people who did training. And they explained what they wanted to accomplish. And everyone around the room went through and said, okay, here's what we think we can do. And then we spent 2 more days figuring out what we would do. They made consistent IA decisions because we had a very integrated, comprehensive content model. The IAs, although there were multiple people performing this role, they didn't have a full-time IA. They had multiple people performing this role for each of the business units that were involved. They made consistent decisions together. It wasn't that one group made one decision and another group made another decision. They had dedicated resources. Again, it's not a full-time position for every team, but they had the role, and the same people were working on the role, and they didn't start over every time. They had the same person who understood and was responsible for representing their group and helping their team comply. The second to the last bullet, keep it simple. Folks have a hard enough job meeting the deadlines, writing the information that they need to write. Don't make it harder for them. The IA has to be super simple for them to, and ideally intuitive, because they'll understand why it helps them. And they centralize their reuse. And if you don't centralize your reuse, first of all, you're not going to have reuse. I can just put it that's just that easy. If you don't centralize it, people are going to do different things, and then your reuse comes to a screeching halt. So these guys did it right. They started from the top, communicated, had measurable iterations, and were able to consistently evolve their IA over time. The unsuccessful use case, I was really tempted just to put all the other bullets from the previous slide in. It's just, they didn't do any of those things. But the biggest issue was that they had different content models for each of the business units, which meant there was no harmonization, that the same element had a different use in different business units. And for instance, they had the same piece of content and they would use a different element to mean the exact same thing. Another example was one team specialized and the other team relied on output classes for everything. They couldn't share content because they didn't have the same reuse strategy. There were too many conditions with too many values. There were different conditions and values by each business unit. They had different replacement text strategies. They had different map structures, so they couldn't even use the same collection of topics between groups. The architecture wasn't enforced in any way. The architect's role was simply to design something, and then it was gone. There was no one embodying that role and on a long-term basis, and whoever stepped into those shoes had zero power and all the responsibility. And last, the team members didn't understand why the content model made a difference. Because they didn't use the elements consistently, this team was translating into a lot of languages, over 50. And so every time this content went to translation, that incurred additional translation costs because it wasn't consistent, and the translators could not simply edit, put in the appropriate localized word. They had to actually touch the model, and that's a problem. So your opportunities, I can't say this more often enough. You don't need a full-time information architect unless you need one. The good news is that governance helps you, whether you have one full-time architect, multiple full-time architects, multiple part-time architects. Governance gives you that framework for working together to evolve the information architecture to meet your stakeholders' needs. Who performs that role needs to be someone who will be good at it. Don't just pick the person who has time. That will not be a recipe for success. Ideally, this is someone who will have that responsibility on a consistent basis so that they have a chance to build the rapport with their stakeholders and the other people that are needed for collaboration to build your governance model. And again, I can't say it enough, make it easy for people to do the right thing. If it's perceived to be harder to follow the architecture in a consistent way than it would be for them to do what they want to do, you're not going to get compliance.
Right, so we'll move on to technology. And technology, sometimes it's hard to convince people that this really fits into a governance model, because you will sometimes get pushback of, why do I need governance? Why do I need rules? I've got this tool that allows me to do certain things and not other things. Isn't that enough? But part of a good governance model for tools and a tool chain is a couple of things. One is it's a full and realistic assessment of what those system capabilities are. What can your system do and not do? And the cliche about this is the cautionary tale that when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But it's actually more than that. It's sometimes mistaking the tool, especially when it's a new tool or you're implementing it, mistaking the tool for the strategy. The tool is a way to implement the strategy, and a tool is something that you can use to sometimes enforce a governance model, but it's not the strategy itself, and it's not the model itself. The other thing with technology is to plan for a validation process that includes revalidation. As Amber talked about in the previous section, things change over time. And especially with tools and technology, if you have a tool chain and a solution architecture that is bound to a process that no longer works for your business needs or for your users, they'll quit using the process correctly. They'll quit executing the process correctly. And also, and eventually when everybody starts doing their own thing, things get chaotic. Chaos is inevitable. So next slide. So an example of a system that is of an organization that has handled the technology space really, really well is they had an information architecture project that defined content as either content collections that were going to be reused across a broad area of their delivery chains, or as document-centric content that was really more confined to a particular set of products and a particular set of deliverables. And because they identified those subject areas, that content by type and by kind, they were able to manage those collections of content differently and to manage them in ways that maximize and optimize their purpose. So this team is able to optimize their reuse and minimize content conflicts where something had to change here and couldn't change there. And this team was able to leverage the features of the CCMS that they were using to support this development process. And one of the things that they were able to really achieve by doing this was enforce some business logic using the system's functionality and the system's capabilities. Previous to this, the business rules that were necessary for them to deliver their content effectively and successfully didn't really have any tool support. So it was reliant on written policies and, in some cases, tribal knowledge of, yeah, you just shouldn't do it that way in other cases. But most of all, was just reliant on good behavior. And you can count on people to behave well in most cases, but when they're under duress and under a time crunch, sometimes those things fall apart and they end up falling apart at critical times. By changing their processes to make the most of the technology that they had available and fit their processes, within the tool's capabilities, and be accurate about what those capabilities were, this was a team that was able to dramatically increase their efficiency. They lowered their maintenance burden on the different kinds of content over time, and taken as a whole, they were able to really significantly cut down the cycle time on their content delivery. They just cut way down on the amount of time it took to get content and get their deliverables out the door, accurate and complete and effective. What that team was able to do as a result of those productivity gains, which in part driven by the tools, was to reinvest that recovered time in other initiatives like content quality that they just never had time or bandwidth for, and new opportunities for enhancing their product offerings, enhancing their deliverables, and making their contribution to the organization better. All right, next slide. On the other hand, this is an organization that committed to a solution design that solved a short-term problem and seemed to be an easily understood solution, but they did so without validating the scalability of the solution and the sustainability of that process and that model over time. And once they were kind of committed to that architecture and committed to that solution, they became chained to it, and their over time, their technical debt to that original decision that was made, a little hastily in a vacuum, became higher and higher. And when their requirements changed, their processes and their technology couldn't adapt because they were so bound down by their processes and by their tools, that the tools became a constraint on their capabilities instead of a way to enhance their capabilities. And the root of the problem was the solution that they chose was really well supported by the tool. It was easy to do, but the solution wasn't scalable. So as a result, the effort over time grew wildly out of proportion to the actual volume of content change. Even the tiniest little changes, the simplest things, took a massive amount of analysis and effort and moving files around and reconnecting things and rebuilding things. So even small changes took a lot of effort, and big changes and big updates to those content collections took superhuman effort. So the effort for the return and the productivity got wildly out of proportion. Next slide. So here are the opportunities in the technology space. One is to identify solutions and solution architectures that optimize processes and that allow you to optimize those processes and get the most out of them, or build those processes around system supported functionalities that takes the burden off of the users and lets the system do some of the heavy lifting. And that can be things like automation of certain steps in the development process and delivery process. It can be business logic that is built into the system, so you don't have to rely on best practices and good behavior, on human limitations. Along with that is recognizing system limitations, that there are certain things that your system may not support very well. So then you go back to the business discussion from the first set of slides, is you recognize that as a risk, and you build governance around that to mitigate those risks, both in your processes and your policies and in your solution design. And then you validate those designs for scalability and for repeatability. And over time, you revalidate those processes to make sure they still work. Does the solution design still meet its intended purpose, or are there new business requirements, new factors, new process requirements that are going to make you reevaluate your business process? So again, we've mentioned it a couple of times that this is a process rather than an event. Part of that process needs to be going back and rerunning your validation process periodically, either as a regularly scheduled event or when you have drivers that lead you to do so, and recognizing what those drivers are.
Yeah, I want to add one thing here, because when you have a technology like a CCMS, like IXIASOFT, when they do an update, take the time to look at what new functionality they're giving you, because there might be a real opportunity here that you've been able to manage other ways that maybe now the system can help you.
Absolutely. All right, on to the next.
Last but not least is process. So what do we think about when we think about process? Well, first of all, that you don't all have to do the same thing, but you need to understand where it matters if you don't. Processes need to exist to support stakeholders. Don't disenfranchise them as you develop them. I mean, you all can think of a time when someone handed you a process that was just egregious to try and implement, and it's because they didn't talk to you. They didn't understand what your job really entailed and what success really looked like. For many people who are implementing governance, they're trying to generate a report that someone can say, yep, checkbox. That's not the kind of process we're talking about. We need to also make sure that folks aren't wondering at work. It's great if you want to wonder why something, like, why is the sky is blue? Why is the sky blue? But you don't want to have to wonder, am I doing the right thing? For every decision point, each stakeholder should be able to act with confidence and know that they're doing the right thing. This happens when you have collaboration points that keeps everybody in sync. And by very clearly explaining how the whole process works together with the different roles, everybody knows what their lane is, and they have the opportunity, and hopefully the incentive, to stay in it. And the last point is really important. A mishap doesn't have to be a disaster. Let's be honest, all the best intentions, things can still happen, but it shouldn't be something that can jeopardize your entire business. The process should have gates in there that allow you to quickly identify when something has gone off the rails and be able to mitigate it early on, so that the consequences are just a data point to say, oh, maybe there's an opportunity for us to update our process so this doesn't happen again.
And happening when those things happen, that's something to track over time. Because if it's the same thing happens where you have wrenches that get thrown into the process, if a pattern starts to form there, that's a trigger to do a revalidation of your process.
Exactly. Yeah. Next slide, please. So our successful use case, this team did so many things right. They follow if it ain't broke, don't fix it. They didn't just go, oh, we're going to start over completely from scratch. They looked at their existing processes, talked to their stakeholders, and said, whoa, what's working? And then they looked at how could process be improved. They met with the stakeholders and let the stakeholders explain all their manual steps, the skills that were required, the dependencies. And then they worked together to automate as much as possible and recognize when automation wasn't possible. There are times when a human must be involved, and then they wanted to make sure that at that point, all the humans did the same thing. It didn't have to be automated for it to be consistent. In some cases, there has to be flexibility, more of a guideline than a code, and there can be multiple paths to the same point. If I'm trying to get to one place and Rob's trying to get to another place, it doesn't matter if I arrive by plane and he arrives by horseback. As long as we get there at the time we need to meet and we have what we need for us to go through the next gate together, as long as everybody understands the consequences of the different paths, it's okay. And particularly for your larger organizations, you're going to have to be flexible. Organizations have to meet users where they are. One of my favorite things is you don't should on somebody. Don't say you should be able to do this, because that immediately puts people on the defensive and you're not recognizing where they are starting. You have to know where they're starting to help them get to where you want them to go. Subject matter experts, unfortunately, they need coddling. They're not invested in the system the way you are. And you have to understand that your goal from the subject matter expert is to get the content into the system. Once this content's in the system, apply all the rigor that you need, because you need to be able to get the content out, but there has to be some flexibility to get it in. Next slide. So our unsuccessful use case is, I think the first bullet pretty much speaks for itself. Towards the second bullet, new groups had zero support. There was no migration path for them to bring their content into the system. They were simply told, hey, here's what our system does. You need to get your content in by this date. Well, that's not going to happen very well. There was no opportunity to expand the process to meet their needs. So what was happening is for each new group, they were being shoehorned into the process that the original group did, despite the fact that their content was different, their products they were supporting were different, their users were different. There was no accommodation made to help them be productive and effective in this system. Everybody tried to reuse the content within their own way, which resulted in the fact that there was no content sharing, even between authors in the same group. This meant that, that within the same business unit, even the conditions, they use different conditions and different value combinations to get the same result, which meant that they couldn't reuse any content because all these conditions were everywhere. And when you generated your content, you had no idea what you were going to get. They didn't leverage the life cycle in the CMS in a consistent way. And so that goes back to the technology. The life cycle management in a CMS is there to help you, but it isn't all of your process. And they just expected the technology to magically make things happen. It's in the system, it's good. And that's not what happens. A system is there for you to leverage and to use. And unless you understand the rest of the work that has to happen, you're not going to get the expected results. And they were completely unrealistic. They didn't talk to their stakeholders. And needless to say, this was a failed implementation of DITA because they couldn't get everyone to be able to generate their content. And so the promise of efficiency and consistency was never met. So for our opportunities, governance gives you a great framework for talking to other stakeholders. It's not, well, this is how we do it. It's, oh, well, here's our common goal. Here are the processes we have. How do these compare to the processes that you currently follow? And what do we need to change in order for us all to be successful? That successful usage is where the processes align. Those gates have to be, you look at your processes and where there's decision points, those need to be aligned. The other tasks that can happen before and after those gates may be different because they need to be, but you have to identify the milestones that must be harmonized. Process shouldn't be a checkbox item. It needs to, for every piece of process that you have, you need to be able to explain why. Don't treat your stakeholders like 2-year-olds because I said so. Does not fly with adults. It probably doesn't fly with 2-year-olds either. Have a process and a framework that allows process to be evolving organically. It shouldn't feel like this dreaded activity. Oh my gosh, we have to update our process. Oh, no one's going to want to do this. It should be happening all the time that, oh, we have this pain point. It's happened 3 or 4 times. Multiple teams have it. Let's talk about how we do better. And again, simple is best. If you make it too complicated, folks are not going to be able to understand where they are in the process and how to make the next correct decision, which results in the correct action. And the review of your existing processes, again, should be happening iteratively. And what's important, what's unimportant. Everything, all these rules are not created equal. There are some things that must happen, and there are some things that, well, it'd be great. We'd have opportunity if we did these things more consistently, but don't pretend that every gate is the same, because that's just not true. And for instance, you have to have consistency so that when you generate your content, it's what you expect. There are some, there's some places where flexibility allows you to still meet that goal.
And the reviewing existing processes, sometimes it's kind of shocking what comes up in those things where when you really get down to why, when you review an existing process, well, why do you take this step? Why does this happen? Why does every time you do this, you do these things? Why? Well, because somebody told me to. Right.
That's the way we always did it.
Right. Which is, do you really need to do it this way? And when you start to look at processes that way and start to, you ask questions of, does this provide a framework for solving problems, or does it provide an opportunity for meeting a business requirement? If you can't answer yes to either of those things, maybe it doesn't need to be a process. It can still be work instruction or job aid or those kinds of things, but it's really process.
And the other thing to note here is not just when they say why they do it, take into account the context of who's saying why they do it. If it's somebody who is holding on to legacy processes, you need to examine, you have to, explain to them how you can get the same result. And they have to get on board. And I keep joking around that I want to do a webinar called Love Your Curmudgeon, because your curmudgeon is going to ask all the questions and stick up, and explain, and has the tribal knowledge of why people do the things they do. These are the people who are great to have in these conversations, but it does take some patience sometimes to refactor their negative statements into positive statements so that you can discern the possibility and that opportunity.
And winning the curmudgeons over is incredibly satisfying too.
Oh, it is. All right, let's finish up.
So where do we go from here? There are a few key takeaways that, from each of these sections that we want you to leave here with. In each of these quadrants, there's fairly simple actions that you can start to take to get down the road toward developing it, either developing a governance model for certain areas if you don't have them, or improving the ones that you already have. So I'll go through the first two and then turn it over to Amber and she'll do the other two. So from a business standpoint, build a framework for decision-making that has a realistic scope, actionable requirements, and a governance model that you can maintain over time. That it becomes an organic part of the way you execute your business processes and meet your business requirements. And then make sure that over time, that governance model is organic to your organization by onboarding resources with effective change management that helps them adopt that common understanding of how business operates within that governance model. From an IA standpoint, establish effective processes that identify requirements and communicate design objectives. and make those shareable and distributable and accessible to all the stakeholders. Make sure all the stakeholders have buy-in on those things, so that everyone has a clear understanding of what the information architecture objectives really are. And then identify and empower information architects to take ownership of that, build it, share it, distribute it. And part of the empowerment means acknowledging that that's a real thing. IAs exist in the world. They're an essential role to good governance of any collection of content that you're going to try to do anything with over time. And allocate the resources accordingly. Make that part of your staffing and resource model, is that even if it's not somebody that's full-time, that's an essential task, an essential function. You have to commit to it and empower it.
And that means dedicating time to it on a regular basis, not once a year. We go and look at the architecture and go, oh, is it good?
Hey, yep, that looks good. Roll it up in a drawer and not look at it again until next year. Yep.
Yeah. So technology, the first thing is investing in optimizing processes that leverage your technology capabilities. You bought the technology for a reason, one would hope, not that it was on sale. And that there's this technology has, been developed, and these are mature products, and most of them, that they are there. And, again, take advantage of life cycle, versioning, all these pieces that will help you keep track of your content in a consistent way. And, acknowledge when when out of the box, your system doesn't have something that you need, but don't just go and customize it immediately. Talk to your vendor, ask them, hey, do you have a solution for this? Do you have a partner who could help us with this? Because the more you do that's one-off and custom, when the update comes, it's going to be a little harder for you. And ensure your solutions design acknowledge those limitations, and make sure that you're not trying to do something that the system isn't meant to do. I see particularly when folks are trying to use a CCMS as a dam. This is not a digital asset management system for most of these systems. If you need things like rights management on media assets, perhaps you need to look at some additional technology into your solutions architecture.
Yep. When I have dirty dishes, I don't put them in the fridge. I put them in the dishwasher.
I don't put them in the clothing washer. I put them in the dishwasher.
Exactly. Use tools for what they do well, and acknowledge what they don't do well, and find other solutions. And if you can integrate those intersections and do systems integration efforts, we had an example of that in the, earlier on, where these two systems were integrated. But that was an example. They didn't try to make their CCMS do something that wasn't meant to do.
And this is where looking at where, scalable, it's not what are the business requirements that you have immediately. It's where does the business want to be in 18 months? Those solution architecture discussions need to happen with at least an 18-month runway. And again, things need to not be one-offs, needs to be repeatable. Process, I can't say it enough. Do not disenfranchise your stakeholders. You know how it feels, and it's yucky. Don't do that to them, because they'll react probably the way you do, which is, yeah, that's fine. You said it, I'm not doing it. We don't want that, because governance is here to help them do the right thing. I like to talk about governance as bowling with bumpers in the gutters. Help them hit pins every time. It's a lot more fun. Develop realistic processes based on your outcomes. If you can't explain how any given process meets the outcomes for the business, it's a type of deliverable, it meets a specific audience needs, it's and a crucial part of the user journey. If you can't explain it, you need to really rethink it, because are you doing it because you always did? Has that business need completely gone away? Work is hard enough. We need to keep this as simple as possible so that folks have the best chance of success, because their success is your business success.
All right. Well, thank you so much to you both for this presentation. So we'll now move to the question section. So we already have a few questions, but just a reminder that you can always type a question right now using the Q&A panel of the webinar platform. So our first question is, how do you know when your business has scaled to the point that you need much more rigorous governance?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say that when your processes start to get beyond what one person can execute, right? And this is the transition that organizations make, where when something in your process needed to happen and a particular person did it, to a particular, it becomes a particular function or a particular group or a particular part of the organization. That's the time, when it is, you should still have a governance model even when it's just single actors. But when you start to have multiple people trying to execute the same processes at the same point in time, that's when you really need, to me, when you really need to start formalizing that stuff, because that's the risk of everybody goes out and solves their problems their own ways. That is not scalable. That's when you run into the scalability problem.
And I think that there's an obvious opportunity when you're implementing your CCMS, because there's roles and permissions built into these systems. How are you going to know who to give what rights to if you don't understand your process, and who should have what responsibilities and what access to content? And so I think that that's if you're implementing IXIASOFT as your CCMS, you should have governance. It's time to start talking about who does what.
Who are the process actors and what are they supposed to do? And when in the process do they do it?
And who should not do things.
Right. And then, to get to some of the things we covered earlier, how do you use the system and how do you use the system functionality to communicate those expectations to your stakeholder so they know what to do, right?
All right. So next question, how large and how often should a governance board meet?
Well, I think it really depends on the size of your organization, your business. And, even if it's a smaller group, I would say that, the folks that are responsible for designing processes should meet with the IA and your CCMS admins and your product manager, who should be telling you what your business goals are. I would say you would want to do it at least every other week, even if it's just a touch base and say, has anything come up? Are there any product changes that we need to hear about? Oh, are we updating anything in the system? Because that has to be communicated. Your system, if you're implementing a new CSS, people need to know. And that, I like to see these, it's a collaboration. And if it's ongoing every other week, it's not a big deal when something comes up. There's a natural opportunity to discuss it.
Yep. I take the same approach, and there's times when things are just kind of chugging along. And if that group doesn't have anything to talk about, you just cancel it. But if you have it on the calendar as a regularly occurring thing, then you don't have to try to find times on people's schedules and get everybody involved. And, we tried to, when I was running this sort of thing, we tried to meet at a minimum of once a month, no matter what. But we had stuff on the calendar every other week, and more often than not, we met. But there's sometimes where it's just like, yeah, we don't have anything to talk about, or so we cancel. But have it as part of everybody's, the people who are involved, it's part of their regularly scheduled activities.
Yeah.
And that's part of the resource commitment. Carve the time out. And if management squawks about it, go prove to them that it's important.
Yeah.
All right. So speaking of, we have a question about management, really. So how do you get management buy-in to invest in content governance?
You figure out what they care about, and then demonstrate why what you are trying to invest in, because it's an investment. It's investment in time, money, and resources. Why this is going to focus, why it's going to have an effect on what they care about. Some managers may care about cycle time. Some may care about quality. Some may care about compliance. Some may care about budget, and and all those things. Find out what figure out what message is going to resonate with them, and then tell that story. right? And that's was always something that a way that I tried to approach it, is understand their stakeholders, right? So understand what stakes they have.
Yeah, and if you're in an iterative or an agile environment, which a lot of companies are now for their development, at the end of each iteration and then at the end of each collection of iterations, there is the opportunity to review. And at that point, anything that did not go as expected or did not go well is a candidate to look at and say, what if we had better governance? What if we had better communication? Why did this happen? And so the folks who are, running these iterations, your scrum masters and folks who are managing your boards, they're great allies to say, okay, because they don't want to see the same thing coming up every iteration. And that's where you can, that's the window in. And, if there is something that results in litigation at the worst case, or additional cost or missed deadlines, one of the first questions should be asked was the process and the governance that was there, what was needed? And if the answer is no, there's a chance to talk about it.
Thank you, Amber. Okay, so next question. So any tips on how to get outside groups to buy into governance? So for instance, to get both a TechPub output and a level 3 support line to use the same metadata in order for a knowledge center to return accurate search results.
So similar answer, I think, to the previous question of try to find a way where you can tell the story that, hey, if participating in this is to your advantage, it's to your advantage, as an organization, because you're going to be able to find content more rapidly. You're going to have more content that's going to help your support cases more accessible to you. Find a reason why participation is advantageous, right? And sometimes it is, you have to incentivize it from a management standpoint, where it occurs at a higher level. Where
I was just going to say, you have to find someone who cares about the numbers, because one of the other things, particularly with tech support, is they want to reduce queries and calls. And if you can say, if we're sharing this information and then we can actually automate the response, like if they put in the chat bot, the question, it doesn't have to go actually to a person. And every support organization is looking to reduce actual representative engagement, because that's where they incur cost. And any coordination on how that information can be delivered in a more automated way is something that somebody in upper management cares about.
Especially if you're going to assign a dollar value to it, honestly. Yeah. When you tell a support organization the inability to find information is, increases the number of support calls, and those support calls cost you $60 every time the phone rings, that gets people's attention.
And the length of call. And we could reduce this call to 30 seconds from 5 minutes if the support people could find what they needed. Yeah, that's a bit of an exaggeration perhaps, but you have to put some actual metrics behind it.
Okay, so we're close to time, but we have a few more questions. So if you have different groups who are using different content models, how do you get them to agree on a single content model?
Well, the first thing is to review the content models in a neutral way. So basically have a show and tell. One group say, hey, this is what we're producing. Like, what are our deliverables? How are they delivered? And here's the content model we have, and here's why. And the other group can do the same thing. If they are delivering completely different content with different structures, then it might be okay that the models aren't the same. But, if you're in DITA, there's about 80 core elements that people tend to use. Those elements need to be used the same way. If you're using, different output classes to get different deliverables out, is that the end of the world? No, but everybody needs to understand that if the other team says, oh, I'm going to start using an output class, if a value is already taken, they will get the wrong output when they put it in. So first of all, be open, transparent about why you have it, what you're trying to accomplish. Don't be judgmental. Don't be thinking that one of you has to change to meet the other. In some cases, you might just say, oh, well, we all use definition list and we're not using it the same way. Is that okay? Yes or no?
And I would, along with that, and it's, it's a point we brought up in a number of different contexts in this session, is those points of intersect. If they have different content models because they have different information design needs and different, information consumer needs, that's fine. That's why those things are different in the first place, perhaps. But if you're going to start sharing content back and forth, at least you have to align on what that shared content is going to look like, the purpose it's going to serve. So it's just, again, put the rigor at those points of intersect, and that'll get a long ways towards not having disruption on one side or the other when content is shared across content models. And
make sure your reuse models are the same, because you cannot,
and make sure they're realistic.
Yeah. One group can't just rely on a gazillion different conditions. If you're in a centralized system, if the other group needs to have the same condition values but get a different output, or they need the same element and it needs to be used in a different way, you have to talk about that, and something has to give. And it won't be easy, but I think the key thing is focusing on what you have in common instead of just immediately zooming in on what you do differently.
Agreed.
All right. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we are out of time. So if we didn't have time to get to your question, we'll answer to you. We'll reach out to you by email. So that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you so much, Amber and Rob, for joining us today. Please stay put after the broadcast ends. We have a survey for you. We want to hear your feedback. It's important. And also, if you're interested in being featured in one of our upcoming webinars, this is your chance. So fill up the survey and let us know which topic you would be interested to talk about. All right, so we hope you've enjoyed this episode. Again, if you have any questions after today, you can reach out to Rob or Amber via the email that's listed on your screen right now. And we hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you want to stay up to date with our upcoming events, of course, you can visit IXIASOFT.com. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you,
everybody. Bye.
Thank you.